I'm Bella Hammond, 45, and I spent 18 years as an Army Special Operations combat medic, the kind of work where you don't leave until everyone gets out. I pulled men from firefights, refused extraction orders, and earned this country's highest military honor. But when 4 young operators walked into the one place I'd finally made my own and decided I was the punchline, in a room full of people who knew exactly who I was, something shifted. Have you ever been reduced to nothing by someone who never bothered to look? If that's happened to you, I want to hear about it in the comments. You are not alone in this. Before we get into what happened that night, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to let a room catch up to the truth about you, hit like and subscribe. This one's for everyone who's been looked through like glass. My father never talked about the war, but he always checked exits. I noticed that before I noticed most things, the way he would pause at the entrance to a room, take stock of it, and only then find a seat. The way he kept his discharge papers in a lockbox on a high shelf in the hall closet, next to a photograph I was not allowed to touch. He had done a tour in Vietnam in 1968. His younger brother had done the same tour and had not come back from it. Neither fact was ever discussed at the dinner table, and I learned early that the silence around those things was not emptiness. It was a kind of pressure. You could feel it pushing against the walls of the house on certain evenings, particularly the ones when my father came home from work and did not take his boots off at the door the way he usually did, and went straight to the back room, and we all understood without being told that dinner would be quieter than usual tonight. My mother worked double shifts at a hospital supply company on the north side of San Antonio. She was practical the way people get practical when practicality is the only option. She kept the house, she kept the budget. She kept the 3 of us, me, my older brother Tomas, and my younger sister Rosa, moving in the right direction without turning any of it into a lesson. I was the middle child, which, in most families, means something generic about being overlooked or adaptable. In my family, it meant I became, without entirely meaning to, the one who read rooms. I was the one who noticed when my father's hands were shaking at breakfast and knew to make sure Tomas talked about something else. I was the one who sat with old Mr. Garza 3 doors down on Saturday afternoons because he had no family that visited, and because it seemed like the obvious thing to do. I was the one who stopped the bleeding when the kid down the block split his knee open on the curb, using my shirt before anyone else had located a first aid kit. I did not have a name for what I was drawn to until I was much older. I just knew that when something went wrong, I was already moving before anyone asked. My mother told me once when I was about 12 that I had a gift for staying calm when it mattered. I thought she was offering a compliment. Later, I understood she was also identifying a cost. Tomas considered enlisting after high school. He thought about it seriously for 6 months, visited the recruiter's office twice, came home both times, and eventually decided against it. He got a job in property management and moved to Houston a few years later. I don't judge that. People find their way by different roads. 2 weeks after Tomas made his decision, without telling him or anyone else I had made mine, I walked into the Army recruiter's office on Military Drive and signed my name. I was 17 and needed a parent's signature, which my mother provided without ceremony. I went back the following summer, the week after I turned 18, and shipped out for real. My mother cried once, the evening I told her. Not in front of me, I heard it through the wall of the room between ours. The following morning she made breakfast and did not mention it again, which was, I understood even then, its own kind of love. My father drove me to the MEP station the morning I shipped out. We did not talk much on the drive. When I got out of the truck, he looked at me for a moment with the same careful look he reserved for the exits of rooms. Steady, measuring, taking full stock of what was in front of him. Then he said 4 words, "Don't forget what matters." He got back in the truck before I could ask what he meant. I let the question sit. I am still letting it sit. Basic combat training was Fort Jackson, South Carolina. I was not the fastest in my platoon or the loudest. I did not draw attention to myself, and I did not need anyone to know I was paying attention, because paying attention was not something I did for an audience. I kept my head down, did the work, and made sure I was never the reason something did not get done. Advanced individual training as a 68 Whiskey combat medic specialist was Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, which meant I spent the better part of a year training nearly in sight of the house I had grown up in. There was something clarifying about that, learning to keep people alive in the same city where I had first started doing it informally with whatever was available. I was promoted to private first class upon completing AIT. I was 19 years old. The instructor who noticed me was a staff sergeant named Fales, methodical, economical with words, the kind of man who measured people by what they did when nobody was watching. In a training scenario where I was playing medic to 3 simulated casualties, I triaged the most critical first without being instructed to. Fails pulled me aside afterward. He said, "Most people freeze the first time. You looked like you'd done it before." I told him I had, just not the way he meant. Fort Bragg came next, my first duty assignment, 1999. I was 20 years old, freshly promoted to specialist, assigned to a unit supporting the 75th Ranger Regiment. I was one of 3 women in my section and the youngest specialist on the floor. I did not draw attention to either fact. I did not need people to understand that I had noticed. The one who mattered most in that first year was Sergeant First Class Darius Cole. He was born in 1975, which made him 24 in 1999, young for an SFC, but Special Operations pipelines compress timelines when the talent justifies it. Cole had 2 overseas rotations and a reputation for bluntness that was fully earned. He ran extra PT with me not because I was struggling, but because he could see what I could become if I learned to hold a pace under pressure rather than just under examination. Cole said to me once, early in my time at Bragg, "Hammond, you're going to be the best medic in this battalion or you're going to break trying. Either way, I'm going to know you did the work." I didn't answer him. I laced my boots and went back to the track. That was always the answer with Cole. He did not want your words. He wanted to see what you did with the next hour. What I did with the next hour, and the hours after that, and the years that followed, was work. I ran the track before Reveille. I read the field manuals until I could reconstruct them without looking. I studied the older medics the way my father had studied exits. Quiet, thorough, looking for the structure underneath the surface, not for recognition. The Army gave me something my childhood had pointed me toward, without naming. A place where the instinct to hold things together had a form and a function, and a use. I was not naive about the institution. But at 20 years old, I was still learning the distance between what an institution promises and what it actually delivers. That education was coming. I did not yet know what it would cost. I was in the barracks common room when the towers fell. September 11th, 2001. The television was mounted above the door, and the room was full of people who had stopped moving. Someone had their hand over their mouth. Someone else was standing with arms at their sides, not doing anything at all, like the connection between the brain and the body had been briefly severed. I watched both towers come down from beginning to end. I did not cry. I did not say anything that would seem meaningful later. When the broadcast looped for the second time, I went back to my room and began inventorying my medical kit, checking supplies, checking expiration dates, doing the thing I knew how to do. Sergeant First Class Cole found me there an hour later. He stood in the doorway and looked at what I was doing and said, "You know what comes next." It was not a question. I didn't treat it like one. I was promoted to sergeant that fall, FIV, my first NCO rank, the first time I was formally responsible for people beneath me, as well as for the patients in front of me. It felt right in a way that mattered. By spring, the unit was operating on elevated readiness, and Afghanistan was coming the way weather comes. You can feel the pressure change in the air before you can name the storm. I deployed in 2002, 23 years old, a sergeant attached to a support element working with Ranger operations in the eastern part of the country. I will not go into operational specifics. What I will say is this. I was the only medic available when 3 men went down in a dry creek bed outside a village whose name I cannot say on record. I got all 3 out. I was written up for a commendation afterward. I never received it. The paperwork was lost in a unit transition. I noticed this the way I had already learned to notice most things the Army did, without performance, without complaint. I filed it and moved on. That was the central lesson Afghanistan gave me that I hadn't already absorbed. The Army would use everything I had and it would not always acknowledge it. That wasn't bitterness. That was the math. You go in knowing the terms, and you either find a way to work within them, or you spend your career at war with arithmetic. I came back quieter, not damaged, just recalibrated. Things that had previously seemed worth worrying about were smaller now. I was promoted to staff sergeant in 2003 and selected for the Special Operations Combat Medic pipeline. My commanding officer, Major Aldridge, called me in to raise the idea of officer candidate school. He framed it as an opportunity. He said, "You've got the ceiling, Hammond. OCS is just the door." I knew what ceiling he meant. I also knew which doors were actually open and which ones only looked that way from the outside. I told him I would consider it. I was already considering it. The same year, after a long field exercise rotation, I found myself at a small bar near Bragg that served veterans and off-duty NCOs. Not a loud place, not a celebrating place, the kind of room where people go to be around other people who do not require explanation. I was sitting alone with a beer when a man sat down one stool over and introduced himself without pretense. Jimmy Hudson, born 1972, 31 that year, recently discharged Army Staff Sergeant, waiting tables and saving money toward California. He had an easy manner and a face that had not tried to hide what it had seen. His younger brother John, born 1982, which made him 21 that year, was currently in the Army, assigned to an infantry unit preparing for Iraq. Jimmy told me this early in the conversation, the way people surface the thing that is actually occupying them. He said, "John doesn't know how to be afraid yet. That worries me more than anything." I didn't tell Jimmy that not knowing how to be afraid was the most dangerous thing a soldier could carry into a war. He would figure that out. They always do, one way or another. We talked for 2 hours. He didn't try to impress me. I didn't try to be impressive. We traded information the way people trade it when they both know what they're talking about, matter-of-factly, looking for what was useful. Later that year, I completed my SFMS pipeline evaluation and scored in the top tier clinically. I was not placed in the most forward-deployed position I had qualified for. A male medic with a lower evaluation score was given it instead. The reason cited was unit cohesion considerations. I filed a formal inquiry. The inquiry went nowhere. Cole, who was nearing the end of his own career by then, told me what he had learned across his years of watching the institution operate. He said, "The Army sees what it wants to see. Your job is to make the picture impossible to ignore." He was right, but he didn't tell me how long that would take, or what it would cost in the years between the work and the recognition. I read the non-response to my inquiry standing alone in a parking lot outside the barracks. I folded the paper once, put it in my cargo pocket, went back to work. That was the only answer that made sense. It was also, I would spend years understanding, a habit that had saved me and cost me in ways I was not yet equipped to separate. The saving part was clear. Someone who does not dwell on what they cannot change is free to keep working, and I always kept working. The cost was less visible but just as real. Every time I absorbed the non-response, filed it, and moved on, I was practicing a kind of self-erasure that was, in the moment, entirely rational. Over years, that practice accumulated into something I would need to actively unlearn. I was teaching myself that what happened to me did not require acknowledgement in order for me to continue. That was true in the practical sense. It was not the whole truth about what continuing cost. Jimmy's is not a loud bar. It has never been a loud bar. It sits on a side street near Coronado in a building that used to be a dry cleaning shop, and it carries the feel of a place that was never trying to be more than what it is. Clean, quiet, familiar. The regulars come for the same reason I do, because it requires nothing of you that you haven't already decided to give. Jimmy has kept it that way deliberately. There is no television mounted above the bar. Music stops after 9 in the evening. He has been serving the same group of people, more or less, for 18 years, and he knows what everyone takes without being told. It was a Tuesday, late in November of 2024. I was 45 years old and 9 years retired, and I walked in at 6:15 in the evening, which is late enough to miss any dinner crowd, and early enough that I have my pick of stools. I took the second from the left, the way I always do. It faces the door, which is habit. You spend enough years needing to know what is entering a room and the habit becomes structural, part of how you sit. And it puts me close enough to the end of the bar that Jimmy can reach me without covering much ground. He set a Modelo in front of me before I had finished settling onto the stool. We exchanged approximately 12 words, which is about average for a Tuesday. It's enough. The 3 corner regulars were in their places. 2 Army veterans I knew by face and first name, and Gunnery Sergeant Holt, retired Marine, somewhere in his late 50s. A man who communicated through the quality of his silences rather than the content of his words. Denise was working the bar, Jimmy's niece, mid-30s, efficient, fully aware that Jimmy's runs on a particular kind of understanding, and careful not to disturb it. I finished about a third of my beer. I read a few pages of the book I had in my jacket pocket. I was not looking for anything except the particular rest that comes from being in a room where you do not have to perform being okay, where you can just be whatever you actually are that evening. Usually tired, occasionally fine. They came in at approximately 7 o'clock. 4 of them, Navy, young, Liberty from a Coronado training rotation. Already drinking, not sloppy yet, but loose in the way men get loose when they have been at it since noon and feel entitled to the remainder of the evening. They moved the way men in a pack move when they are looking for something, scanning for hierarchy, scanning for an audience, scanning for sport. The biggest one, I would later learn his name was Derek Marsh, Petty Officer First Class, born 2000, 24 years old that November, clocked me within 30 seconds of walking in. Middle-aged woman, alone, civilian clothes, quiet beer. He made a decision. I watched him make it across the length of the room. I have spent a long time watching people make that particular decision, and I can see it before the person has finished arriving at it. He walked over and stood between me and the bar, blocking my stool from the front. His friends arranged themselves behind him the way punctuation arranges itself behind a statement. "You lost, doll? Let a real operator buy you a drink." His friends laughed. The corner of the room went very quiet. Holt did not move, but the quality of his stillness shifted, became something more deliberate. The two Army veterans at their table stopped talking. They had all seen my photograph on the wall behind Jimmy's bar. They had been looking at it for 15 years. They understood exactly what was happening and exactly what they would not do, which was intervene, because this was not their moment, and they knew that. I did not raise my voice. I did not move off my stool. I looked at Marsh the way I have learned to look at things that require accurate assessment. Steadily, without surprise, taking the measure of what something actually is, rather than what it's presenting. I took a sip of my beer. I said nothing. The silence carried weight. Marsh's friends started shifting their footing. This was not the response they had constructed the moment for. Marsh pushed. "Come on, sweetheart. We're just being friendly." By 45, I had stopped carrying the vocabulary I used to carry for rooms like this. I said, quietly, "I'm fine where I am." Jimmy set down his rag. He did not rush. He walked the full length of the bar, unhurried, deliberate, the pace of a man who has been patient about something for a long time, and stopped beside me. He looked at the 4 seals the way you look at something that requires clarity more than it requires conflict. Then he pointed upward at the framed photograph on the wall behind the bar. A younger version of me in dress uniform, hands clasped with the president's, the Medal of Honor being placed around my neck at the White House in 2006. "Gentlemen," Jimmy said, "that's her. She pulled my brother out of Fallujah, twice." The room held its breath. Marsh's eyes went to the photograph. Back to me. Back to the photograph. His face changed, not in one moment but across approximately 4 seconds, which is how long it takes for community knowledge to surface when someone finally connects the name to the person in front of them. Every operator in the special operations community knows the story of the medic who refused 2 extraction orders and stayed under fire until every wounded man was out. The story has been in circulation for nearly 20 years. He stepped back. "Ma'am, I didn't." I looked at him, steady, tired, without triumph, without satisfaction. This moment, in one form or another, had been the whole shape of my adult life, the room that did not know, the person who assumed, the institution that looked past. I was done performing the correction. "Sit down, son," I said. "Drink your beer." He sat. All 4 of them sat. The corner regulars exhaled. Jimmy refilled my Modelo without being asked. For the next hour, Jimmy told them the rest. The creek bed in Afghanistan, the lost commendation, Fallujah, the 47 minutes. Not because I asked him to, and not because the SEALs deserved it, but because he had been carrying it for nearly 2 decades. And it mattered that someone say it out loud. When they left, every one of the 4 stopped at the door and saluted. I did not turn around. I raised my glass to the photograph the way I always do. Jimmy refilled my drink. I have been saluted by men who knew exactly who I was, and I have been dismissed by men who did not bother to look. Both happen. The second one does not stop carrying weight just because you have learned to expect it. The Second Battle of Fallujah began in November of 2004. I was 25 years old, a newly commissioned 2nd Lieutenant 1 Army Medical Corps, and I arrived in Iraq thinking about logistics, what I had, what my element had, what the next several hours were most likely to demand. I did not arrive thinking about history, because thinking about history while operating is a good way to die. You think about what is in front of you. You think about what your hands need to do next. Everything else is a distraction that costs someone their life. The operation was house-clearing Marines and Army Rangers working through a dense urban sector block by block, the kind of close-quarters fighting that turns a city into a series of small, contained decisions with large and irreversible consequences. My element was supporting. I will not describe it as a movie, because it was not a movie. There is no score underneath it. There are no clean angles, and there is no pause for any individual moment to register as significant before the next moment is already on top of it. It was decisions made faster than conscious thought, one after the next, with no interval between them for anything as slow as hesitation. The first casualties came from a corner building secondary IED detonation, partial structural collapse, 3 men down in a space still taking fire from a position we had not yet identified. I was moving before the extraction order came through. The order came anyway, on the radio, approximately 20 minutes into the action. I told the radio, not yet. I had 3 men down in a structure that was still taking fire, and I was not finished with them. That was the first refusal. The second extraction order came 20 minutes later. By then I had 2 men on the litter system and was working the structure for the third. I found him in a courtyard on the interior side of the building, not visible from the street, not visible from any angle a moving unit would have scanned. He was against a blown-out wall and he had a penetrating chest wound and he was still breathing. He was asking for water. His name was John Hudson. He was 22 years old and a private first class in an Army infantry unit deployed from Fort Hood, and I did not know at that moment that his older brother Jimmy owned a bar near Coronado, or that the older brother had met me in a bar near Fort Bragg the previous year and told me that John didn't know how to be afraid yet, and that this worried him more than anything. I did not know any of that. I only knew that John was breathing, that I had what I needed to keep him breathing, and that the second extraction order was wrong. I stabilized him on the ground. I sealed the chest wound with what I had available, called for the carry, and did not stop working until every man was out of that structure. By the time I cleared it, I had been under fire for 47 minutes. I was not physically wounded. I threw up in the vehicle on the way back to the forward operating base and did not mention it to anyone. John made it. All 3 made it. That evening, I filed the incident reports, spoke to the chaplain briefly once, and did not speak to anyone about what had happened in that courtyard for a long time afterward. Not because I had made a decision not to. Because I did not know how to put words around it that would be accurate. The words that existed for it, heroism, valor, courage, felt like the wrong shape for the actual experience. I do not know what courage feels like from the inside. I know what it looks like from the outside because I have seen it often enough to recognize the shape. What I did in that courtyard felt like arithmetic. You add up the situation, you subtract the hesitation, you move. That is not courage the way people want courage to sound. The weight of it, the gravity, the conscious decision to risk yourself for another. In the moment, there is no weight, because there is no moment. There is only the next thing the situation requires. The nomination process for the Medal of Honor took more than a year. I was promoted to first lieutenant in 2005 and to captain in 2006. There were interviews, written statements, review boards, and medical assessments. The ceremony took place at the White House in 2006. The president shook my hand. The photograph was taken, the one that Jimmy would eventually hang behind his bar, the one that Marcia's eyes would find 18 years later in that bar in November, crossing the distance between who he had assumed he was talking to and who I actually was. I flew back to my duty station the morning after the ceremony and did not request leave. People have asked if that seemed wrong to me, returning so quickly, as if the moment deserved more dwelling. The honest answer is that returning seemed like the only natural thing. The ceremony was about a single moment. The work was still there. The flight back was about what came next. Jimmy called me 6 months after Fallujah, once John had been stabilized and transferred stateside for continued care. He did not say thank you, not directly, not in those words. He said, "I'm opening a bar near Coronado. You'll always have a stool." I believed him without needing to consider it, which is not something I can say about most things people tell me. In 2006, at the opening, Jimmy hung the photograph behind the bar without asking my permission. He had gotten a copy from somewhere, the official White House photograph, framed in plain wood, hung at eye level behind the bar where everyone who came in would see it before they saw much else. I looked at it for a long moment from my stool. I said, "That's going to make me self-conscious every time I come in." Jimmy said, "Good. You should come in more." He was right on both counts, as he generally is, about the things that matter. After Fallujah, I went back to work, because that is what soldiers do and because there was nothing else I would have done with the time. The medal changed my public profile inside the community and changed almost nothing else. People treated me with a degree of deference that I found, mostly, inconvenient. I did not want deference. I wanted to do the work, which was what I had always wanted, and deference was noise around the work. I deployed to Iraq in 2007, Afghanistan in 2008, Iraq again in 2010. I was promoted to major in 2010-04, at 31 years old. Each promotion felt less like an achievement and more like a change in the paperwork that governed what I was allowed to do next. I kept a running log of every patient I treated across all those years. The log was not official, it was a personal record, handwritten, a small notebook I replaced whenever one filled up. By 2012, the log had 847 entries. I shared this number with no one. I kept it because it felt like the only honest accounting of what the work actually was, not the commendations, not the operational summaries, not the after-action reports written for institutional consumption. Just the names, the presenting conditions, and the outcomes, one after the next, across the full span of what my career had actually been. I still have every one of those notebooks. The deployments after 2010 were shorter and stranger. The wars had shifted from kinetic operations to advise and assist rotations, to something that did not carry a clean name or a clear definition of success. I was capable at all of it: the operational work, the advisory work, the medical training of partner force elements who had different doctrines and different constraints and different relationships with risk. I was less capable at the bureaucratic realities that surrounded the work, the staff rotations, the positions where the principal product was a document rather than an outcome. I served a rotation in a SOCOM advisory capacity that produced a set of operational medical doctrine recommendations, careful work, specific work I believed in, that were later adopted by working groups and folded into standard guidance without individual attribution. I filed this under the same mental heading as the Lost Afghan Commendation from 2002, things the Army used without acknowledging, the math I had decided, years earlier, to accept. In 2013, outside Kandahar, an IED detonated 30 meters from my vehicle during a medical advisory mission. I was not the primary casualty. 2 soldiers were in worse condition, and I treated them before accepting my own evaluation. The assessment documented traumatic hearing loss in my left ear and compression fractures in 2 lower lumbar vertebrae. I completed the required medical hold and returned to duty within the allowable window. The injuries were entered into my permanent medical profile. I knew before the dust had settled what a profile like that would mean for a promotion board. A medical profile with documented hearing loss and spinal damage in a 44-year-old. I was 34 at the time. But that is what the board would see when my file went up in 2015, was a data point that argued against advancement to senior leadership, regardless of what else the file contained. I chose not to spend energy on that calculation in the moment of the injury. I treated my soldiers and then accepted my own evaluation, and then got back to the advisory rotation. I am not certain that was the right decision. I am certain it was the only one I was capable of making at the time. The promotion board for 05 convened in 2015. My file was competitive by every measure I could identify. Strong evaluations across the full span of my career. Multiple combat deployments. The medal. The SOCOM advisory work. The published doctrine, uncredited as it was. I understood that promotion boards weigh a set of factors I could not fully see from the outside, that the combination of the medical profile, the years on medical hold, and whatever informal frictions I had accumulated across nearly 2 decades of flagging operational decisions I disagreed with, had created a composite picture that the board read differently than I would have read it. The board came back non-select. The reviewing officer was Lieutenant Colonel Harriet Sohn, born 1963, 52 years old that year. A career officer who had navigated the institution by making different choices than I had at every fork in the road. She was competent. She was the institutional face of a decision that was about institutional math, rather than individual conduct. We met once, briefly, in a hallway outside a conference room. She informed me of the non-select in the standard professional language, and offered the standard language about a second board consideration. I asked her directly whether the medical profile had been the determining factor. She said, "There were multiple factors, Major." That was the answer. Not what she said. The fact that she did not say anything further. I submitted my retirement paperwork 48 hours later. I did not request a second board. The institution had gotten from me what it needed to get, and I had gotten from it what I had needed to get, and the arrangement was complete. I was 36 years old. I had served for 18 years. I called Jimmy that night from the apartment I had rented in the DC area during the staff rotation. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I'm done, Jimmy." He said, "Yeah, I know. Come out here." I said I would think about it. I was in San Diego within the month. I drove rather than flew. 3 days across the country. I did not tell anyone I was leaving except Jimmy and my mother. My mother said to drive carefully and to call when I arrived. My father had died in 2012, a heart attack, quick, while I was deployed, and I had not made it back in time for the service, which was a thing I had filed and not put down. I thought about him on that drive. I thought about the 4 words he had said at the MEPS station. I thought about the lockbox on the high shelf. I had never found out what was in it. By then, it didn't matter. I understood what it had meant to keep it closed. The first 3 weeks in San Diego, I slept more than I had slept in a decade. I did not frame this as depression, because I did not experience it that way. I experienced it as debt collection, 18 years of sleep the body was owed and had not been permitted to take. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment 7 minutes from Jimmy's, functional and sparse, and I slept. When I was not sleeping, I sat in the apartment with the stillness of a person who has finally stopped running and does not yet know what to do with the stopping. The engine was still running, the track had simply ended. I started part-time consulting work with a private trauma response firm, remote work, reviewing medical protocols and training materials, adequate pay. Nothing demanded of me that I had not already given many times. It kept me from staring at the ceiling for 8 consecutive hours, which was the primary service it provided in that first season. It was not what I would have chosen, if choosing had been the operating condition. But I was 36 years old in a new city with no assigned position for the first time in my adult life, and movement in any direction was preferable to no movement at all. I was also, though I did not yet have complete language for it, adjusting to the particular strangeness of not being needed in the way I had been needed for nearly 2 decades. In the Army, people needed you to know specific things, to make specific decisions, at specific intervals. In a 1-bedroom apartment in San Diego, nobody needed anything from you except what you had already decided to give. Jimmy's helped more than the consulting work did. I established my ritual in the first month, Tuesday and Thursday evenings, second stool from the left, Modelo, out by 9. Jimmy refilled my glass and occasionally told me things about John, who was in Tucson now, doing construction management, had 2 kids, called Jimmy on Sundays. I listened. It was the only news about John that I could take in that didn't require me to know what to do with it. John sent me a letter in early 2016. I read it 4 times over 2 days and did not write back. I asked Jimmy to tell him I had gotten it. I did not write back because I did not know what to say that would not turn his life into a monument to mine. He deserved to just be John, not the man I pulled from a courtyard in 2004. That distinction mattered in a way I could not fully articulate and did not try to. The transition from active duty to civilian life carries a set of losses that nobody prepares you for and that the VA pamphlets describe in terms that are accurate but not sufficient. You lose the structure. You lose the language, the shorthand, the shared reference points, the way that rank and roll communicate a great deal without explanation. You lose the clarity of purpose that comes from having a defined mission, even when the mission is difficult, even when you disagree with how it's being executed. I had thought, when I submitted the retirement paperwork, that I was primarily losing the Army's institutional claim on my time. What I found in those first months in San Diego was that I had also lost the framework that told me what kind of person I was supposed to be in any given hour. I had to find that myself, which turned out to be the slower and harder project. At the suggestion of my VA primary care physician, I attended a veteran support group in early 2016. I went twice, did not speak much, and was on the verge of stopping when I was referred, one-on-one to Dr. Renata Osei, born 1977, 39 years old when we first met, a psychologist at the San Diego VA who specialized in special operations, veterans, and moral injury. Osei did not open our first session by asking how I felt. She asked what I missed. I answered before I had finished deciding whether to answer. I said, being needed, actually needed, not consulted, needed. She asked, was there a version of the Army where they needed you as much as you needed them? I sat with that question for 3 weeks. The answer was no. The Army had always needed what I could do, which is a different thing from needing who I was, but the question itself changed something the way a properly placed instrument changes the pressure in a wound. You feel it working before you understand precisely what it did. In 2016, a military affairs newsletter I still received published a brief item noting that 2 of the operational medical doctrine recommendations I had written during my SOCOM rotation had been formally adopted and credited to the working group, not to any individual. I closed the newsletter. I sat with the particular quality of that feeling for a few minutes, not quite fury, not quite grief, something with the texture of both, and then I called Osei's office and moved my next appointment up by 3 days. I told her about it at the session. She asked, what would it mean if they had credited you? I said, nothing. But it would mean something that they didn't. She wrote that down. I wrote it down later, in the journal I had started keeping for the first time since my 20s. I had started the journal in the same month I started running again, not PT, just for the rhythm of it, just to have something to put my body into in the mornings that had no destination and no performance standard and no one watching to assess whether I was doing it correctly. Jimmy noticed the shift before anyone else named it. He said one Thursday evening that I looked less like I wanted to fight the parking lot. I told him I still wanted to fight the parking lot sometimes. He said sure, but less. He was right. It was measurably less, and measurably less was the only kind of progress that was real. The consulting firm expanded my role in 2017. The new position involved developing training curricula for civilian first responders based on combat casualty care principles, field triage protocols, tourniquet application, hemorrhage control, airway management in conditions of limited resources. It required travel. Phoenix, Chicago, Atlanta. It required classrooms. And those classrooms were full of people who had no knowledge of my history in the Army, which turned out to be exactly what I needed. To those rooms, I was simply the person who knew what I was talking about. Not the Medal of Honor recipient, not the woman at the bar who should not be there, not Major Hammond, not the Fallujah medic, not any of the versions of myself that other people had constructed and then encountered me through, just the person in front of the room with the knowledge, just useful. That felt clean in a way I had not expected and could not entirely account for the first time I noticed it. I felt it standing at a whiteboard in Phoenix in front of 20 civilian paramedics, and I recognized it as something I had not felt since the early years at Fort Bragg. When the work was just work and the complications were still ahead of me, I was good at teaching. I had not known this about myself with certainty until I started doing it regularly. The underlying capacities had always been there, the ability to read what a room needed, to pace information to the person receiving it, to stay level while someone else was working something out. In the field, those skills had served one set of purposes. In a classroom, they served another. I had more patience with people's fear of making errors than I would once have expected of myself. I had learned, by then, that fear of doing harm is not the same as incompetence. Sometimes, it is its opposite. The paramedic who is frightened of applying a tourniquet incorrectly is paying attention in a way that matters. You work with that rather than around it. In 2018, by mutual agreement, Renata and I ended our formal therapeutic relationship. The dynamic between us had shifted enough over the preceding year that maintaining a clinical framing would have been dishonest. She had become the person I called when something confused me emotionally, not often, but when it happened, and that relationship deserved to be named accurately. We had dinner for the first time in April of 2018 at a Vietnamese restaurant on the bay near the Embarcadero. I ordered the wrong dish and we argued amiably about pho for the better part of 20 minutes, which was approximately the most ordinary I had felt in years. She said at some point, "You know you're allowed to have a friend who isn't a veteran." I said, "Jury's still out on whether I'm allowed to have a friend at all." She laughed. That was the correct response. I have had dinner with Renata at least once a month since then, and I have never fully stopped being surprised by how uncomplicated it is. John Hudson came to San Diego in the summer of 2019. He came with his wife and one of his children for a family trip, and he stopped at Jimmy's on a Tuesday afternoon because Jimmy had told him I would be there. I knew he was coming. Jimmy had told me a week in advance, giving me what he understood correctly to be the information I needed to decide whether to stay. I stayed. When John walked in and saw me, he stopped for just a moment, and in that moment I saw him working through what this encounter was: gratitude, or something older than gratitude, or something that did not resolve into any single word. Neither of us had a clean framework for what we were to each other. He was the man I had pulled out of a courtyard. I was the person who had been there when the thing happened that changed his life. Those facts didn't resolve into a simple relationship. We were something more specific and less categorized than that. We talked for 40 minutes. He told me he coached youth soccer in Tucson, that he had 22 kids on the team this season, and that 3 of them had genuine talent. I told him about the curriculum work and the travel. Neither of us mentioned Fallujah directly, which was the right call. His daughter Lily, 7 years old that summer, John's kid with his wife Claudia, fell asleep on the bar stool beside me about halfway through the conversation. I looked at her for a moment without saying anything. John watched me look at her. He said before he left, "I tell people I'm lucky. That's true, but it's not the whole truth." He didn't say what the rest of the truth was. He didn't have to. I knew what survival cost, not just the physical cost, but the cost of carrying the knowledge that it was contingent, that the thing between alive and not alive was sometimes 47 minutes and one medic who didn't leave. His life was fully his own now. The courtyard had returned it to him. It was not mine to hold. In 2021, the training organization published the first edition of its curriculum manual. I had spent 3 years developing the content, running pilots, revising based on feedback, working with subject matter experts in several regional programs. The manual had a formal acknowledgments section. My name was in it. I brought it to Jimmy's on a Tuesday evening and set it on the bar. He picked it up, opened it to the acknowledgements page, read for a moment. He said, "Look at that." I said, "It's an acknowledgement section." He said, "I know what it is." We sat with that for a moment. Then I looked at something else, and he refilled my glass, and that was all the occasion required. By 2023, my life had a shape it had not possessed a decade earlier. 3 days a week of consulting work, 4 mornings of running, Jimmy's on Tuesdays and Thursdays, monthly dinners with Renata, my mother on Sunday mornings. I had not been in a relationship since 2011. I did not hold this fact with grief or with pride. It was simply true, the way several things about my life were simply true, requiring neither apology nor explanation nor revision. I had learned in the years since retirement that I was not easy to be close to, that this was not a flaw requiring repair so much as a condition requiring honesty. I had found, mostly, people who could work with it. I had learned to work with it myself. That had taken longer. I had stopped waiting for my life to feel like something it wasn't. I had stopped comparing the life I had to the life I had expected to have at 25, or the career that the institution had concluded for me at 36. I let it be what it was, the consulting work, the running, the 2 evenings a week at the bar, the friendship with Renata that had become, without drama and without announcement, one of the more honest things in my life. That turned out to be enough. Not complete, not healed. I was not sure that was the right word for what I was working toward, or whether the destination was a state rather than a practice. But enough. Level. I also noticed, with more clarity than before, how often the people coming into the work I did were carrying the same blind spots that had cost me, the unwillingness to ask for the thing they needed, the pride that presented as competence, the insistence on translating everything back into the language of operational excellence, rather than the language of a person trying to figure out what came next. I recognized the posture. I had worn it for years. I did not announce this recognition or make it the subject of lectures. I just worked with it. In Phoenix in the spring of 2023, at a first responder training session, I met a former Army Ranger named Castillo, 26 years old, 8 months out of service, technically enrolled in the program but visibly uncertain about what he was doing there. He was not asking for help. He was too proud for that, which I understood precisely because I had worn the same pride at exactly that age, upright and functional and costing more than it appeared to. I did not offer help directly. I made sure he connected to the mentorship network through the program and left the channel open. 3 months later, he sent an email saying he had been hired for a position in emergency medical services coordination. I read it at my kitchen counter and waited 2 days before responding. When I did, I kept it brief. I had learned not to make a monument of someone else's getting better. One Tuesday evening in the summer of 2024, a group of younger veterans came into Jimmy's army, recently discharged, mid-20s, a little lost in the particular way of people who are between identities and haven't found new language yet. They were respectful, drinking more than was entirely wise, sitting together in the way that people sit when they are not sure they deserve to be comfortable. I watched them for a while. Then I bought their next round without introducing myself or explaining why. Jimmy raised an eyebrow across the bar. I shrugged. I was not certain it helped anything. I had not done it to help, precisely. I had done it because I remembered what it felt like to be in a room full of people and have someone treat you like a person before you had earned it back from yourself. Nobody had ever explained what they were doing when they did it for me. I had known anyway. I was running the bay one morning, in early autumn, the lights still flat at 6 in the morning and the air carrying the particular coolness that the San Diego mornings carry before the day asserts itself. And I thought about what the year had looked like from the outside. The work, the routine, the measured progress on a set of goals that had replaced the goal I had lost in that hallway in 2015. It was a smaller life in some ways. It was also, I had come to understand, a more honest one. I was not performing anything for anyone. I was just doing the things I had decided were worth doing. That was new. It had taken the better part of a decade to get there. Over dinner in October of 2024, Renata asked me without framing it as a clinical question, just as a friend asking a friend what I thought I still needed to work out. I considered for a long moment. I said, I think I still want people to see me accurately. Not the medal, not the woman at the bar who shouldn't be there. Just accurately. Renata asked, do you think that's something you can give yourself, without needing it from them? I did not have an answer. I thought about it for 3 weeks, the way I think about questions that don't have quick answers. Then one Tuesday evening in November, I walked into Jimmy's, and 4 young men walked in behind me and gave me the circumstances to find out. The evening before had been a Monday. I ran the bay at dawn, worked a consulting call, ate leftover rice and beans standing at my kitchen counter, read for an hour, set the book down, turned out the light. Nothing about it announced what was coming. The moments that change things never do. You only understand what they were after they have already happened, already become part of the shape of the story you are telling yourself about your life. That is always how it works. You find out after. 2 weeks after the bar, I was still going to Jimmy's on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Same order, same time, same 12 words with Jimmy before he set the Modelo down in front of me. Whatever had shifted in that room on that November evening had not shifted the routine. The routine was not the thing that had needed shifting. Derek Marsh came back on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the confrontation. He came alone, in civilian clothes, and sat 2 stools down. He did not approach me for 20 minutes. I could see him working up to it in my peripheral field without appearing to watch, the way you learn to observe a room when you have spent years needing to know what it is doing. When he finally moved, he was direct and brief, which I respected. He said, "I came back to apologize correctly, not because I had to, because I wanted to." I looked at him. He was 24 years old. He did not know much yet, but he knew that, and I respected it without needing to express it in those terms. I said, "Apology accepted. Now leave it there." He stayed for an hour and ordered 1 more beer and did not say anything that required me to correct it. I considered this growth, and not the small kind. 2 days later, I called my mother, not the managed version of the call I had been making on Sunday mornings for years, the fine and busy version, the version that told the minimum necessary to communicate that I was alive and functional, something closer to the actual thing. I told her about the bar, not all of it, just the incident and what Jimmy had done. My mother listened in full and then said what she always says when she has been paying close attention and does not want to overstate it. "Your father would have liked that bartender." She was right. She had always been right about that. He would have liked Jimmy very much, and the thought settled between us on the line without needing to be explained or developed. Renata's response, at our December dinner, was different from what I might have predicted. She heard the whole account without interrupting and then did not analyze it. She asked a question she had not asked in October. She said, "Did you feel seen in that moment, when Jimmy pointed at the photo?" I took a real moment with it, not the pause before a managed answer, but an actual interval of sitting with the question. I said, "I felt like, for about 4 seconds, the room understood the distance between what I am and what people assume. Yeah, that's probably as close to seen as I get." Renata didn't say that wasn't enough. She didn't say it was. She held it. That was why I had kept coming back to her for 9 years. In the weeks following November, small things returned. Sleep came more readily, not every night, but more nights than before. I ran longer in the mornings, for the pleasure of the movement rather than the discipline of it. I finished a book I had been staring at for 2 months. In December, I sent John a text just, "Heard Lily's playing soccer now." "Good." He responded with 3 words and an emoji that made no contextual sense, and I laughed, alone in my apartment at 7 in the morning, without qualifying the laugh or making anything further of it. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. It was enough. I had not walked away from the army. I had served it until the math stopped adding up, and then I had stopped, and those were not the same thing. I had not walked away from that bar in November either. I had sat there and let a 52-year-old man with a rag and a photograph do what I had not been able to do for myself. Receive it. Let it land. Let the room hold the weight of what I was for 4 seconds while I sat on my stool and drank my beer. On the first Tuesday of January, 2025, I walked into Jimmy's at 6:15 in the evening. Second stool from the left. Modelo, no ice. Jimmy behind the bar. The photograph on the wall where it had been for 18 years. I raised my glass to it not for the ceremony, not for the White House, not for the moment when everything had finally resolved into clarity, because there had been no such moment, and I was done waiting for one. For the courtyard, for John, for the 47 minutes, for SFC Cole, and the track in the dark before Reviel, for every name in the log I had kept across 18 years of work, 847, and the ones that came after. For the 18-year-old version of myself who laced up my boots and went back to the track because that was the answer and I had always known it was the answer. I've been asked if I regret it, the service, the cost, the years of being looked through like glass. I've never had a clean answer because the question isn't clean. The answer is, I would do it again. Not because it was worth it, some of it wasn't, but because it was mine. Every hour of it. The parts that got recognized and the parts that didn't. That's what nobody tells you about carrying something hard for a long time. Eventually, it stops being a burden. It just becomes part of how you stand. I took a sip, set the glass down. Jimmy refilled it without asking. I looked at the photograph for one more moment, Then I looked forward at the bar, at the door, at the quiet room where nobody needed me to perform anything at all. I settled into my stool the way you settle into something that has finally, after a long time, become yours. Sit down, drink your beer. You've earned the right to be where you are. That's the full story. 18 years of work, the institution used, and didn't always name. A bar where I just wanted to sit quietly, and 4 men who decided I was someone they could dismiss until a 52-year-old bartender pointed at a photograph and the room went still. I want to hear from you. Have you ever done the work, completely carried it, sustained it, given it everything, and still been handed an assumption that erased all of it? Have you ever been in a room where someone looked right through you and then had to just sit there and let the truth do what it does? And if someone has ever had to speak up on your behalf when you were too tired to correct the record yourself, tell me who that was and what it meant. Those are the people worth keeping. Drop your story in the comments. Subscribe for more true accounts of service, sacrifice, and what it actually looks like to reclaim your ground. I'll see you in the next one.